The air hung thick with monsoon humidity as Corporal James Anderson squinted through the reticle of his optical sight. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the firing controls of the M50 Ontos, a peculiar six-barreled tracked vehicle that some called the Thing, and others called a death trap. From his position on a low ridge overlooking a bend in the river, he could see the first PT-76 amphibious tank emerging from the tree line, its Soviet-made hull glistening in the early morning light of July 21st, 1967. Behind it, a second tank appeared, then a third. The North Vietnamese army was making their move, just 3 kilometers south of the demilitarized zone in Quang Tri province. "Confirm visual on enemy armor," crackled the radio. "Hold position and await air support. Do not repeat. Do not engage." Anderson's jaw tightened. The nearest air support was 20 minutes out. His finger hovered over the trigger as he watched the column of tanks advancing toward the river crossing, directly where Fox Company lay exposed in their hasty defensive positions. The Marines had no heavy anti-tank weapons besides his lone Ontos. "Sir, with respect," Anderson spoke into his throat mic, "by the time air gets here, those tanks will be rolling through our boys." "Those are direct orders, Corporal. You're outgunned. Fall back to secondary position." Anderson removed his helmet and wiped the sweat from his brow. Through his scope, he could see the faces of the Marines in their foxholes, young men from places like Detroit, Birmingham, and Shreveport. Some were praying. Others were checking their M72 laws, knowing the light anti-tank weapons would barely scratch the Soviet-made armor. The lead PT-76 was now 300 meters from the crossing, 275, 250. Anderson made his decision. He swung the Ontos into position, its 6 106mm recoilless rifles glinting in the sun. His loader, Lance Corporal Rodriguez, looked at him with wide eyes. "They said to fall back, Corp." "And I say those boys don't die today," Anderson replied, already adjusting his sights. "Load all tubes. We're going to give these NVA a 6-barrel surprise they won't forget." No one in the 3rd Marine Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite battlefield history and save dozens of lives. No one knew that a 22-year-old black Marine from rural Mississippi was about to demonstrate why, sometimes, the most heroic action a soldier can take is to disobey. James Anderson was born on April 7, 1945, in the small town of Fayette, Mississippi, just as the war in Europe was drawing to a close. His father, Elijah Anderson, had served with the segregated 925th Engineer Aviation Regiment in the Pacific, building airfields under Japanese fire in New Guinea and the Philippines. Upon returning home, Elijah found that his service earned him little respect in the still segregated South. "My daddy always told me that a man proves himself by what he does when the shells are falling, not by the color of his skin," Anderson would later recall. Said it was the only time he felt like a full American, when the Japanese were shooting at him and the white boys next to him. The youngest of 5 children, James grew up working the family's small farm, developing the muscular build and mechanical aptitude that would later serve him well. School was a 12-mile walk each way, but he rarely missed a day. His mother, Sarah, had been a schoolteacher before marriage and insisted that all her children receive an education. That boy could take apart and reassemble any engine by the time he was 12, his older brother Thomas would later say. Didn't matter if it was a tractor, truck, or generator. He just had a way of understanding how things fit together. In 1963, when James was 18, he witnessed television coverage of fire hoses and police dogs being turned on civil rights protesters in Birmingham, Alabama. That same week, he walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office in Jackson. "Why the Marines?" the recruiter asked. "Because they're the best," Anderson replied, "and I aim to be among the best." Boot camp at Paris Island was a crucible that forged many men, but for black recruits in the early 1960s, it carried additional challenges. Though officially desegregated since 1949, the Marine Corps still harbored pockets of prejudice. Drill instructors pushed Anderson harder, expecting him to fail. "They put me on the rifle range thinking I'd never shot before," Anderson later told his squad mates. "My daddy had me shooting squirrels for the pot since I was 8. I qualified expert first try." After basic training, Anderson's mechanical aptitude earned him assignment to the motor transport school at Camp Lejeune. He excelled in the technical aspects of vehicle maintenance, particularly tracked vehicles. His instructors noted his ability to diagnose problems that baffled others. Private Anderson possesses exceptional mechanical intuition and problem-solving skills. Red 1 evaluation, recommended for advanced technical training. In 1966, as American involvement in Vietnam intensified, Anderson volunteered for combat duty. Despite his technical background that could have kept him in a safer rear echelon position, he requested assignment to a frontline unit. "If I'm going to wear this uniform," he told his commanding officer, "I want to earn it the way my father did." He was assigned to the 3rd Anti-Tank Battalion, 3rd Marine Division, and underwent specialized training on the M50 Ontos, a unique and controversial weapons system that many considered obsolete even as it was being deployed to Vietnam. The Ontos, Greek for the Thing, was unlike any other vehicle in the American arsenal. A small aluminum-armored tracked vehicle mounting 6 106mm recoilless rifles. Originally designed as a tank destroyer for a European conflict that never materialized, the Ontos was nearly scrapped before being sent to Vietnam. Marine commanders initially didn't know what to do with it. The vehicle's light armor made it vulnerable to mines and rocket-propelled grenades. Its main weapons, the 6 recoilless rifles, had to be reloaded from outside the vehicle, exposing the crew to enemy fire. Most damning of all, many officers considered it too specialized for the counterinsurgency warfare of Vietnam. But in the hands of crews who understood its capabilities, the Ontos proved devastatingly effective, particularly in infantry support roles. The 6 rifles could be fired individually or in salvo, delivering massive firepower against bunkers, buildings, and enemy concentrations. Each rifle fired a 10-pound high-explosive shell at 2,300 feet per second. When Anderson joined his unit, the more experienced crewmen looked at him skeptically. "You sure you can handle this beast, Mississippi?" asked Staff Sergeant Miller, the platoon leader. Anderson studied the vehicle for a moment, then walked around it, running his hand along the barrels, checking the firing mechanisms and sighting system. "It's just a machine, Sergeant," he replied, "and I've never met a machine I couldn't master." Within weeks, Anderson had earned a reputation as one of the most skilled Ontos gunners in the battalion. He developed an intuitive feel for the vehicle's capabilities and limitations. While others saw an ungainly collection of guns on tracks, Anderson saw possibilities. "The key to the Ontos is understanding what it's not," he explained to new crewmen. "It's not a tank. It's not an APC. It's 6 big guns that can move. Use it right, and nothing can stand against it." By early 1967, Anderson was a corporal and primary gunner on his Ontos, with Lance Corporal Rodriguez as his loader and Private First Class Miller as driver. They had already seen action during Operation Prairie near the DMZ, where their vehicle had destroyed several enemy bunkers and saved a pinned-down Marine platoon. "That man has a gift," Rodriguez told others in the unit. "He can place those 106 shells through a window at 800 meters. I've seen him do it." He had no idea that soon, those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for an entire Marine company. By the summer of 1967, the war in Vietnam had reached a critical juncture. American forces numbered more than 463,000 troops, with the 3rd Marine Division bearing much of the fighting near the demilitarized zone that separated North and South Vietnam. While much of the conflict involved counterinsurgency operations against Viet Cong guerrillas, the area just south of the DMZ was different. There, Marine units faced conventional North Vietnamese Army, NVA forces, equipped with artillery, heavy weapons, and increasingly, armor. The NVA's 924th Division had been infiltrating men and equipment through the DMZ, despite international agreements prohibiting military activity in the zone. Intelligence reports indicated that Soviet-supplied PT-76 amphibious tanks had begun arriving in the region, presenting a new threat to American forces. The PT-76 was a light amphibious tank designed for reconnaissance and infantry support. Weighing 15 tons and armed with a 76mm main gun, it was not as formidable as a main battle tank, but remained a deadly threat to infantry in prepared positions. Its amphibious capability made it especially dangerous in the river-laced terrain of Quang Tri Province. Major General Bruno Hochmuth, commanding the 3rd Marine Division, had issued specific orders regarding enemy armor. Fixed defensive positions are to be avoided when facing armored threats. Call for air support or artillery. Small units are not to directly engage enemy armor without proper anti-tank assets. The problem was that proper anti-tank assets were in short supply. The Marine Corps, focused on counterinsurgency and helicopter-borne operations, had deployed to Vietnam with limited heavy anti-tank capabilities. The M72 law, light anti-tank weapon, carried by infantry, had proven underpowered against even the relatively light armor of the PT-76. On July 20, 1967, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, was dispatched to establish blocking positions along the Cam Lo River, a tributary of the Qua Viet River. Their mission was to prevent NVA forces from flanking Operation Buffalo, a major offensive operation taking place to the northeast. Captain Thomas Williams, commanding Fox Company, established his positions along a bend in the river where the terrain provided some natural defensive advantages. The company of 185 Marines dug in along a 2-kilometer front, with the heaviest concentrations covering likely crossing points. Williams had requested tank support, but was denied due to the difficult terrain and higher priorities elsewhere. Instead, he received one M50 Ontos from the anti-tank battalion, the vehicle crewed by Corporal Anderson, Lance Corporal Rodriguez and PFC Miller. "This is what division sends us to stop armor." Williams complained to his executive officer. "One Ontos? It's better than nothing, sir," the XO replied, "and I hear the gunner is one of the best." Williams positioned the Ontos on a small rise that provided good fields of fire over the most likely river crossing point. He instructed Anderson to remain in a concealed position unless enemy armor appeared, then to engage only under specific orders. "Your job is fire support against infantry," Williams told Anderson. "If tanks appear, you call it in and displace to alternate positions. You are not, I repeat not, to engage armored vehicles without direct orders. Those PT-76 outgun you." Anderson listened to the instructions, but studied the terrain with a skeptical eye. The nearest air support was stationed at Chu Lai, nearly 20 minutes flying time away. Artillery support from Camp Carroll was available, but would have limited effectiveness against moving armored targets. "With respect, sir," Anderson said, "if those tanks hit us, 20 minutes is a long time to wait." "Those are our orders, Corporal," Williams replied. "We're a blocking force, not an assault element. If armor appears, we call it in and adjust our positions accordingly." Anderson nodded but continued studying the landscape, mentally calculating distances, angles, and fields of fire. He noted the narrow approaches to the river crossing, the areas of dead ground, and the positions where his Marines were most vulnerable. "We'll make it work, sir," he said finally. That night, as a steady rain fell on their positions, Anderson gathered his crew around a map illuminated by a shielded flashlight. "If tanks come," he explained, pointing to various points on the terrain, "they'll use these approaches. They'll be channeled here and here. That gives us shooting positions from these 3 points." "But the captain said not to engage," Rodriguez reminded him. Anderson looked up from the map. "Sometimes you have to make decisions based on what's in front of you, not what someone 20 kilometers away thinks is happening." "You planning on disobeying orders?" PFC Miller asked nervously. "I'm planning on keeping our boys alive," Anderson replied. "Now let's check our ammo load and make sure all 6 rifles are perfectly bore-sighted." He had no idea how prophetic his preparations would prove to be, or that in less than 12 hours he would be making the most consequential decision of his life. The first indication of trouble came shortly after dawn. A Marine forward observer reported movement in the tree line 1 kilometer north of the river. Through binoculars, they could make out the distinctive silhouette of PT-76 tanks, not just 1 or 2, but a full company of 11 vehicles. Captain Williams immediately radioed battalion headquarters. "Sabre 6, this is Fox 6. We have visual on enemy armor, approximately 11 PT-76 moving toward our position. Request immediate air support, over." The reply was not encouraging. "Fox 6, this is Sabre 6. Air support is engaged elsewhere. Nearest assets can be on station in approximately 20 minutes. Adjust your positions and avoid direct engagement. Artillery is being coordinated. Over." Williams cursed under his breath. His company was spread along 2 kilometers of riverbank in fighting positions designed for infantry defense, not anti-tank warfare. The M72 laws carried by his Marines had a theoretical range of 300 meters, but were most effective under 150 meters, meaning the enemy tanks would be well within firing range of their own 76mm guns before the laws could be effectively employed. "All units, this is Fox 6, Williams transmitted. "Enemy armor approaching from the north. Prepare to adjust positions on my command. Do not repeat. Do not engage unless directly threatened." Anderson had already spotted the tanks. From his concealed position on the ridge, he had a clear view of the column advancing in a staggered formation. Through his optical sight, he could see the lead tank commander standing in his cupola, binoculars raised, scanning the far riverbank. "Driver, start engine," Anderson ordered Miller. "Rodriguez, check all firing circuits and make sure all tubes are loaded with heat rounds." Heat, high-explosive anti-tank rounds were specifically designed to defeat armor. The shaped charge could penetrate the relatively thin skin of a PT-76, especially from the sides or rear. As Anderson watched, the NVA tank column approached the river. Instead of immediately attempting a crossing, they spread out along their bank, using the tree line for partial concealment. The lead tank fired a ranging shot that exploded in the water about 50 meters from the Marine positions. The radio crackled. "All units hold fire. Repeat, hold fire." Anderson keyed his mic. "Fox 6, this is Ontos 1. I have clear shots on multiple tanks. Request permission to engage." "Negative, Ontos 1. Maintain position and await air support." The second tank fired, this round striking closer to the Marines' positions. A third shot from yet another tank landed directly in a foxhole, and Anderson could hear screams over the radio as Marines called for a corpsman. The tanks were firing methodically, walking their shells across the Marine positions while remaining safely out of range of the laws. Each explosion sent dirt and shrapnel scattering over the foxholes where Marines huddled, unable to effectively return fire. "Fox 6, they're picking us apart," Anderson radioed urgently. "We need to take out those tanks now." "Hold position, Corporal," came the terse reply. "Air support is 15 minutes out." Another explosion, another scream over the radio. Anderson looked through his sight again and saw the tank commanders growing more confident, directing more precise fire onto the Marine positions. 2 of the PT-76 began moving into the river, their amphibious capabilities allowing them to cross while continuing to fire. Anderson made his decision. He turned to his crew. "Rodriguez, verify all tubes are loaded with heat. Miller, move us to firing position Alpha." "But, sir," Miller began. "Now, Private," Anderson cut him off. "Those are our brothers getting killed down there." The Ontos growled as Miller guided it from its concealed position to a small knoll that offered a clear field of fire. As they crested the rise, they were fully exposed, but so were the PT-76. "Fox 6, this is Ontos 1, Anderson transmitted. "I am engaging enemy armor." Before anyone could countermand the order, Anderson lined up his sights on the lead tank, now halfway across the river. He adjusted for distance, wind, and the movement of the target. "Fire 1, he said calmly, pressing the trigger. The Ontos shuddered as the first recoilless rifle blasted, sending a 10-pound heat round downrange at nearly half a mile per second. Through his sight, Anderson watched as the round struck the PT-76 precisely where the turret joined the hull, the weakest point in its armor. The tank erupted in a fountain of fire and black smoke, its ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. "Shift right, on Tank 2, Anderson ordered, already adjusting his sights. "Fox 6 to Ontos 1, cease fire immediately. That is a direct order." Anderson ignored the transmission. "Fire 2. The second rifle belched flame, and another PT-76 rocked as the round penetrated its side armor. Its turret began spinning wildly before stopping, the tank dead in the water. The remaining tanks were now aware of the threat. 2 of them turned their turrets toward the Ontos position on the ridge. "Miller, reverse 5 meters, then forward to position Bravo," Anderson commanded. The driver responded instantly, backing the vehicle down behind the knoll just as enemy shells whistled overhead. "They've got us bracketed," Rodriguez warned. Not for long, Anderson replied. Move to position Bravo now. Miller drove the Ontos 30 meters to the right, emerging on a different part of the ridge. Anderson was already acquiring his next target. Fire 3, fire 4. 2 more rifles thundered in rapid succession. The third round missed, but the fourth struck another PT-76 directly in its engine compartment. Black smoke poured from the rear of the vehicle as its crew bailed out. The NVA tanks were now in disarray. Some continued firing at the Marine infantry positions, while others attempted to locate and engage the Ontos. But Anderson kept moving between pre-selected firing positions, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted. Fox 6 to Ontos 1, what is your status? 4 rounds expended, 2 tanks confirmed destroyed, 1 damaged, Anderson reported. Continuing engagement. There was a pause before the reply came. Understood. Continue mission. Air support is still 10 minutes out. Anderson allowed himself a grim smile. The captain had recognized the reality of the situation. The Ontos was the only thing keeping his company from being overrun. Miller, position Charlie. Rodriguez, prepare to reload tubes 1 and 2 after next firing. The Ontos rumbled to its third firing position, this one offering an angle on the rear aspect of several PT-76 that were now attempting to withdraw. Fire 5, fire 6. The last 2 loaded rifles roared. 1 round struck a tank squarely in the rear, igniting its fuel and ammunition in a catastrophic explosion that threw its turret 15 meters into the air. The other round disabled the tracks of another tank, leaving it immobile but still able to fire. All tubes empty, Rodriguez reported. Dismounting to reload. This was the most dangerous moment. To reload the recoilless rifles, Rodriguez had to exit the vehicle and physically insert new rounds from outside. Anderson covered him with the Ontos, 50 caliber spotting rifles, smaller weapons mounted coaxially with the main guns that fired tracer rounds to help the gunner aim. As Rodriguez worked feverishly to reload, enemy machine gun fire began to target their position. Bullets pinged off the Ontos' thin armor. Hurry it up, Miller called from the driver's compartment. 2 tubes reloaded, Rodriguez grunted as he slammed in another round. 4 to go. Anderson continued firing the spotting rifles at any enemy movement, keeping the NVA infantry pinned down. Through his sight, he could see the remaining PT-76s attempting to regroup. One had completely crossed the river and was threatening the right flank of Fox Company's position. Forget the rest, Anderson ordered Rodriguez. Get back inside. Once the loader was safely aboard, Anderson immediately trained his sights on the tank that had crossed the river. Fire 1. The rifle thundered and the round struck true, penetrating the tank's turret and setting off its ammunition. The explosion was so violent it lifted the 15-ton vehicle completely off the ground before it crashed back down, burning furiously. Fire 2. Another tank, this one still in the water, took a direct hit to its lightly armored top. Black smoke billowed from its hatches as its crew scrambled to escape. By now, the remaining PT-76 were in full retreat, using smoke grenades to cover their withdrawal. Anderson had destroyed or disabled 6 of the 11 tanks in less than 5 minutes, with just 8 rounds. Fox 6 to all units. Enemy armor withdrawing to the north. Maintain defensive positions. Air support is being redirected to pursue retreating forces. Anderson slumped back in his gunner's seat, suddenly aware of the sweat soaking his uniform and the ringing in his ears from the concussion of the recoilless rifles. Did we just take on 11 tanks? Rodriguez asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. And 1, Miller added. Anderson checked his watch. The entire engagement had lasted 7 minutes and 38 seconds, less than half the time it would have taken for air support to arrive. In that time, he had destroyed or disabled 6 enemy tanks and forced the retreat of 5 others. But he had also directly disobeyed orders, and as the adrenaline faded, that reality began to sink in. Fox 6 to Ontos 1. Report to command post immediately. Anderson keyed his mic. Ontos 1 copies, on our way. As they drove down from the ridge toward the company command post, they could see Marines emerging from their foxholes, looking at the burning tanks along the river with expressions of amazement. Some pointed at the Ontos as it passed. Others simply stared. Captain Williams was waiting when they arrived, his face an unreadable mask. "Corporal Anderson, a word in private." Anderson climbed down from the ontos, removed his helmet, and followed the captain a few paces away from the others. "You directly disobeyed my orders," Williams said without preamble. "Yes, sir, I did." "You exposed yourself and your crew to unnecessary risk." "Yes, sir." Williams studied him for a long moment. Then his expression changed. "You also saved this company from being overrun and likely prevented dozens of casualties." The captain extended his hand. "Thank you, Corporal." Anderson blinked in surprise, then shook the offered hand. "I'll have to include your disobedience in my report," Williams continued, "but I'll also be recommending you for the Silver Star. What you did out there was something I've never seen before." Word of the engagement spread quickly through the battalion, and then the division. Colonel Stanley, the regimental commander, visited the site personally to inspect the destroyed tanks and interview Anderson. "Talk me through your decision process," Stanley instructed. Anderson described how he had analyzed the terrain, identified firing positions, and recognized that the company would suffer heavy casualties before air support could arrive. "The Ontos was designed to destroy tanks, sir," Anderson explained. "That's what we did." 6 tanks with 8 rounds, Stanley mused. "That's exceptional shooting, Corporal. The PT-76 has thinner armor than what the Ontos was designed to defeat," Anderson replied. "And we had the advantage of elevation and surprise." Stanley nodded thoughtfully. "Your action will be studied at Quantico, you know. It contradicts our current doctrine on light anti-tank vehicles." Anderson didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply stood at attention. "At ease, Corporal," Stanley said with a hint of a smile. "Not every day a man rewrites the tactics manual." Later that week, a message arrived from division headquarters. Anderson was to report to General Hochmuth's command post the following morning. He spent the night cleaning his uniform and polishing his boots, unsure whether he was being summoned for commendation or court-martial. When he arrived, he was ushered into the general's office immediately. Hochmuth, a tall, imposing figure with silver hair, looked up from a map table. "Corporal Anderson, I've read Captain Williams' report of your action on July 21st. The general's voice gave no indication of his thoughts. "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir, I did." "Why?" Anderson took a deep breath. "Because sometimes the man on the ground sees things that aren't visible from headquarters, sir. I knew what my vehicle could do. I knew what those tanks would do to Fox Company, and I knew air support wouldn't arrive in time." Hochmuth studied him silently for a long moment. "You understand that military discipline requires orders to be followed?" "Yes, sir. And yet you chose to disobey." "I chose to complete the mission, sir. The mission was to prevent enemy armor from overrunning our positions." "That's what I did." Hochmuth's stern expression finally cracked, and he nodded slightly. "Well said, Corporal. The Marine Corps has always valued initiative in its NCOs." He picked up a document from his desk. "I'm approving Captain Williams' recommendation for the Silver Star. Furthermore, I'm directing that your tactics be incorporated into our anti-armor training protocols." Anderson stood speechless. "That will be all, Corporal. Carry on." As he left the command post, Anderson felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, pride, but also a nagging sense of unease. He had been celebrated for breaking the rules. What message did that send? His answer came that evening when he returned to his unit. Rodriguez and Miller had organized an impromptu celebration, complete with contraband beer and congratulations from Marines throughout the battalion. But it was a conversation with a young lieutenant from Fox Company that stuck with him. "You know what the difference is between bravery and foolishness?" the lieutenant asked. "Results," Anderson ventured. The lieutenant laughed. "That's what they'll tell you at OCS, but no, it's understanding. You didn't just blindly disregard orders. You understood the situation better than anyone else. You understood your capabilities, and you understood what needed to be done." That understanding would serve Anderson well through the remainder of his tour in Vietnam. The six-barrel surprise, as it came to be known, was studied by Marine Corps tacticians and incorporated into training for Ontos crews. The engagement demonstrated that the much-maligned vehicle could be devastatingly effective when properly employed, especially against lighter armored threats. Anderson would go on to receive his Silver Star in a formal ceremony, where General Hochmuth praised his exceptional courage and tactical acumen in the face of overwhelming odds. The citation specifically mentioned his destruction of 6 enemy tanks and the salvation of Fox Company from certain catastrophe. Upon returning to the United States in 1968, Anderson faced a country torn by anti-war protests and racial tensions. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. occurred just 2 weeks after his return. The Medal of Honor recipient would later recall standing in his dress uniform at a bus stop in San Diego when a white woman crossed the street to avoid him. "Funny thing," he told his brother. "Over there, nobody cared what color the man was who saved their lives. Back here, some folks still can't see past it." Anderson left the Marine Corps in 1969 and returned to Mississippi, where he used his mechanical skills to open a small but successful auto repair shop. He rarely spoke about his experiences in Vietnam, and many of his customers never knew they were having their cars fixed by a Silver Star recipient who had single-handedly changed Marine Corps anti-tank doctrine. In 1973, he received a letter from Captain Williams, who had gone on to become a major. "I thought you'd want to know," Williams wrote, "that the Marine Corps has officially revised its armored vehicle engagement protocols based largely on your action at Cam Lo. The new doctrine emphasizes that battlefield commanders must evaluate real-time conditions and employ available assets based on immediate tactical necessity rather than predetermined guidelines. In other words, they've officially sanctioned exactly what you did. Your disobedience has become doctrine." Anderson kept the letter framed on the wall of his repair shop. In 1982, a Marine Corps historian tracked Anderson down for an oral history project documenting the Vietnam War. The historian was particularly interested in the ONTOS, which had been phased out of service in 1969. "Looking back," the historian asked, "do you think the ONTOS was an effective weapon system?" Anderson thought for a moment before responding. "Any weapon is only as good as the person using it and their understanding of its capabilities. The ONTOS wasn't a tank, and it wasn't meant to be used like one. It was 6 big guns that could move quickly. Used right, it could change a battlefield in minutes. And you used it right?" "I used it necessary," Anderson corrected. "There's a difference. That difference between what is right and what is necessary would become a central theme when Marine Corps officer candidates studied the Cam Lo engagement. The case posed fundamental questions about battlefield initiative versus the chain of command. In 1994, the Marine Corps Command and Staff College in Quantico invited Anderson, now a successful business owner nearing 50, to speak to a class of majors and lieutenant colonels about his experience. "The hardest decision you'll ever make isn't between right and wrong," he told them. "It's between wrong and necessary. Following orders is usually right, but that day it was wrong for those Marines about to die. What I did was necessary." A colonel in attendance later wrote, "Anderson's perspective fundamentally challenged our traditional view of the chain of command. He demonstrated that true leadership sometimes requires the moral courage to disobey when the situation demands it." By the early 2000s, James Anderson had become a quiet legend in Marine Corps lore, an example of what one Marine with courage and initiative could accomplish. When the Iraq War presented new challenges in urban armored warfare, instructors at the School of Infantry would often reference Anderson at Cam Lo as an example of tactical flexibility. In 2007, 40 years after the engagement, Anderson was invited back to Quantico for the dedication of a small museum exhibit featuring the ONTOS. Only a few of the vehicles remained in existence, most having been scrapped after their Vietnam service. The one placed in the museum bore the tactical markings of Anderson's vehicle. Standing before the 6-barreled vehicle that had changed his life, Anderson placed his hand on its worn armor. "Never thought I'd see one of these again," he remarked to the museum curator. "This particular one never saw combat," the curator explained. "But we've painted it to match yours based on photographs." Anderson nodded. It wasn't much to look at, but it did the job when it counted. Later that day, he met with a group of young Marine officers, newly commissioned and preparing for deployment to Afghanistan. One lieutenant asked him what advice he would give them about leadership in combat. "Trust your training, trust your Marines, and trust your judgment," Anderson replied. "The battlefield doesn't care about rank or race or where you come from. It only cares about results. That evening, at a dinner in his honor, Anderson was approached by an elderly man who introduced himself as Robert Carter. "I was there," Carter said. "Fox Company, 2nd Platoon. I was in a foxhole when those tanks started firing on us. I want to thank you for what you did that day. A lot of us wouldn't be here if you'd followed orders." Anderson shook the man's hand, momentarily unable to speak. "I never got to thank you back then," Carter continued. "They moved us out right after, and then I took shrapnel 2 weeks later and got sent home. But I've told my children and grandchildren about you, about how one man with courage changed everything in just a few minutes." As Anderson drove home to Mississippi following the reunion, he reflected on the curious irony of his life. His moment of greatest recognition had come from an act of disobedience. Yet, that disobedience had been rooted in the deepest values of the Marine Corps: initiative, decisive action, and protection of fellow Marines. The 6-barrel surprise at Cam Lo would eventually be included in the Marine Corps' official history of the Vietnam War. The engagement was described as a textbook example of individual initiative and tactical flexibility in the face of overwhelming odds. When Anderson passed away in 2011, his funeral was attended by Marine Corps officers of every rank, including the Commandant himself. His silver star was displayed alongside his photograph, and a restored ontos, one of the last in existence, was transported to the cemetery for the ceremony. The eulogy, delivered by a 3-star general who had studied Anderson's action as a young officer, captured the essence of the man and his moment. James Anderson faced a choice that day in 1967: follow orders and watch his fellow Marines die, or disobey and risk court-martial. He chose the harder path, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. In doing so, he reminded us that courage sometimes means standing alone, even against your own chain of command, when lives hang in the balance. The story of Corporal James Anderson and his 6-barrel surprise transcends the specific tactical engagement at Cam Lo. It speaks to a deeper truth about military service and leadership, that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is to disobey when blind obedience would lead to disaster. In military academies and officer training programs across America, the case is still studied as an example of what the Marines call disciplined disobedience, the recognition that initiative in combat often requires deviation from standard procedures when conditions demand it. Anderson understood something fundamental that day, wrote Marine Corps historian Colonel James Henderson in 2015. He understood that orders exist to serve the mission, not the other way around. When following orders would have undermined the very purpose they were meant to achieve, the protection of Marine lives and the defeat of enemy forces, he made the harder choice. The 11 PT-76 tanks that approached Fox Company that July morning in 1967 represented one of the largest armored threats faced by Marines during the Vietnam War. The fact that a single ontos crewed by 3 Marines managed to destroy or disable more than half of them remains one of the most lopsided victories in modern military history. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Anderson's story is how he returned to civilian life with the same quiet competence that had marked his military service. The man who had changed Marine Corps doctrine and saved dozens of lives spent his post-war years fixing cars, raising a family, and contributing to his community. He never considered himself exceptional, his daughter Sarah would later recall. When I finally learned what he'd done in Vietnam, not from him, but from one of his Marine buddies who visited, I asked why he never talked about it. He just said, "I did what needed doing, lots of others did the same." But not everyone did the same. Not everyone had the courage to disobey when necessary, the skill to execute flawlessly under fire, or the judgment to know the difference between reckless insubordination and necessary initiative. As America's military continues to face complex battlefields, where junior leaders must make split-second decisions with limited information, the legacy of James Anderson and his 6-barrel surprise remains profoundly relevant. It reminds us that warfare is ultimately a human endeavor, where courage, judgment, and moral clarity can transcend doctrine, technology, and even the chain of command. In the small town of Fayette, Mississippi, a modest memorial now stands in the town square, a bronze plaque depicting an ontos with its 6 barrels raised in salute. The inscription reads simply, In honor of James Anderson, USMC. When duty demanded courage beyond obedience, he answered. Visitors to the memorial often ask what courage beyond obedience means. The answer lies in that moment on July 21, 1967, when a young black Marine from rural Mississippi looked through his sights at 11 enemy tanks, heard the order to stand down, and decided that the lives of his fellow Marines mattered more than following the rules. So the next time someone tells you that heroism is always about following orders, remember the story of Corporal James Anderson and his six-barrel surprise. Remember that sometimes the truest loyalty requires the courage to disobey. Remember that sometimes one person's judgment in the heat of battle can rewrite military doctrine, change the course of an engagement, and save lives that would otherwise be lost. And perhaps most importantly, remember that heroes often don't see themselves as heroes at all, just as people who did what needed to be done when it mattered most. So, would you have broken the order or obeyed it? The answer may reveal more about your character than any other question you could ask yourself. And in that revelation lies the enduring power of this remarkable story. Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage really means.